Let's talk about parabolas. Parabolas are what we call the graph of a quadratic function, so something with an x squared or a second degree polynomial. To get an idea of what they look like, I'm going to do this first one and actually the next few examples by just using tables, and then we're going to talk about some key characteristics of these graphs. So I am going to create a table, and I'll just pick some values for x, and then I'll find the values for y. Now, anytime you're graphing, if you ever get stuck, this is pretty much a good go-to method. It's just making a table, plugging in some input values, and seeing what y values go with them. So I'll start with 0 and I'll put it in the middle, and I'll do a couple values above and a couple values below 0. And now I'll just go and I'll plug in all of these values to my equation. So my first one is a -2, y equals x squared. And I do always advise anytime you're plugging in something for x, make sure you put parentheses and then put your number inside the parentheses. And that saves you from a lot of issues, especially with negatives and when you're using a calculator. And it's just good practice. So I have my parentheses, that represents my x, and I put the -2 in the parentheses. So that whole parentheses replaces my x. I then just square and I get 4. So -2 gives me +4 for y. I'll go ahead and go through these next 4 values pretty quickly, and I'll fill out my table. Okay, so here is my complete table. Now all I'm going to do is take these values and put them onto my graph. -2, 4, -1, 1, 0, 0, 1, 1, and 2, 4. Now it does kind of look like a V, but a V actually comes from an absolute value function. The quadratic gives us more of a U-shaped graph. So when I connect them, I'm going to connect them in a nice smooth curve, and it gives us somewhat of a U shape to our graph. So this is what a parabola looks like. It's basically a U-shaped graph. I'm going to go ahead and erase the math that I have on here, and we're going to talk about some of those key characteristics that I keep talking about. Okay, so one of the most important things that you're going to hear over and over when you're talking about parabolas is the vertex. The vertex is basically the turnaround point of your graph. It's either going to be the highest point or the lowest point on your graph. Now in this graph, I have my vertex down here, and it is the lowest point on my graph. We call that a minimum value, and that point happens at 0, 0. Another key characteristics of parabolas is what we call the axis of symmetry. And that just splits your graph right down the middle, and it shows you that the left half and the right half of your graph are exactly the same. They kind of fold over and map onto each other. So my axis of symmetry is going to go straight down through the middle, and it's going to cross through the vertex. And it's a whole line. It's not just a point, it's a whole line. So when you're writing the axis of symmetry, we need to write it as an equation to represent the fact that it's a whole line, not just a single point or a single value. It's a vertical line, so my equation is going to be x equals whatever number we're on for x. And your x value is always going to match the x value of your vertex. So my vertex is 0, 0, which means my x is 0. And if you look at that line, x is 0 no matter where you're at on that line. No matter how high up or down you go, x is always 0. So that's where that equation comes from. Another couple important things are your x-intercepts. And that is where your graph crosses the x-axis. So now I'm looking here, and I want to know, where does my graph cross? Well, it just so happens to only cross one time, and that point is at the vertex. So my x-intercept is at 0, 0, and that is this point here. Again, it just so happens to be the vertex. It's not always going to end up that way, but it does in this graph. You will then commonly be asked for your y-intercept, and your y-intercept is where your graph crosses the y-axis. So that would be along this line here, and again, it just so happens to be at your vertex, but that doesn't happen for every graph, it just happens for this one. So my y-intercept is also at 0, 0. So this point right here is where we cross that y-axis. So these are some pretty key features of parabolas that you might be asked for. We're going to do it a couple more times and have a couple different situations, so we'll get to see a few different examples. Okay, so let's graph this one. I'm going to do the same thing. I'll just create a table, plug in the values, and sketch my graph. I'll go ahead and take a second and plug in all 5 of these to fill out my table. Okay, so there's my table. I'm going to go ahead and throw all of these onto my graph, connect the dots, and then I'll erase all this work so we have a nice clean slate to start with. Okay, so there is my parabola. Let's go and find the vertex. We'll talk about the axis of symmetry, the x-intercepts, and the y-intercept. Okay, so my vertex we talked about as being kind of that turnaround point. So in this case, it is that bottom point of my graph. That would be right here. And that point is 0, -4. So my vertex is at 0, -4. My axis of symmetry is the vertical line that goes straight down through the middle of my graph. So that would be right here. And we said that that is always an equation. It's going to be x equals the x value of our vertex, which is 0. My x-intercepts in this graph, they're going to be a little bit harder to find. So they are the 2 points where my graph crosses the x-axis. So I have one right here and one right here. Now, I'm not going to go through and find these algebraically. That's really the only way we can be super precise about what these values are. So let's just look at the graph and kind of estimate what those numbers might be. So that first one I'll do on the left. I'll do this one here. That is going to have about -1.5 for its x value and then 0 for y. And then the other one on the right hand side looks like maybe about +1.5 and then 0 for y. Now the last thing we'll talk about are my y-intercepts. My y-intercepts are where we hit the y-axis. So I'm looking at where do we hit this line. And again, that just so happens to be also at the vertex. So my vertex here is also my y-intercept at 0, 0. Okay, let's do one more example. This one is going to have a linear term. And by linear term, we're talking about this middle one where it has an x to the first power. I'll still create a table and I will plug in the same x's. These ones are going to take a little bit more work to plug in the x's because you have more than one x in your equation. So when I plug in that -2, I'm going to put my parentheses for the first x and for the second x. Be super careful about your parentheses. Put them for every x that you're inputting. So I'm going to go through and I'll finish this one and then I'll complete the rest of my table as well. Okay, so there's my table. Now some of these you'll notice have some pretty big y values, so I'm not going to be able to fit all of them on my graph. I'm just going to do my best, put the ones that do fit, and then hopefully we'll have enough to kind of see the graph of our parabola. So -2.5, -1.3, 0.5, and then 1.11 is off my graph, so that would be maybe up here, and then 21 is definitely off my graph. So I'll start at the right and connect. And then the left, you'll see bounces back up and does kind of match that right-hand side. That's because parabolas are symmetric, so the left should match the right. My vertex is at the bottom. The point that I'm looking for is this one right here, and that point has the coordinates -1, 3. So my axis of symmetry, I'll abbreviate AOS, is the equation x equals -1. And that just gives us that vertical line that goes straight down through your vertex. My x-intercepts, you'll see that your entire graph here is above the x-axis, and at no point do we ever cross the x-axis. So there are none. And then my y-intercept is where my graph crosses the y-axis. So we're looking, where does it hit here? And that would happen at this point, which is the coordinates 0, 5. So this was a super brief introduction to parabolas. I hope that helped. Thanks so much for watching, and I'll see you next time. Bye.